So it's nice having you on my podcast again. And
Thanks.
and since I'm based in Asia, can you like introduce yourself a little bit about like where you come from and your background for those coaches in Asia?
Hey, my name is Glenn Smith. I'm a coach at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. I've been coaching primarily track and field for about 17, 18 years. I'm from Canada originally, Calgary. Yeah, I coach mostly here at UCF. I coach mostly the jumpers and the throwers and heptathletes, but I have coached sprints as well, kind of everything really. I was a sprinter myself.
Cool. So, uh, the first thing I want to ask is like because I heard the other podcast you did, and I was like curious about like how did those movement in the hip and the spine affect our like sprinting performance?
hmm Yeah, so many years ago, I used to train with Dan Paff when I was a athlete, and he kind of exposed me some of those ideas a long, long time ago, and so they've been kind of gestating over many years. And a guy named Serge Grasovetsky wrote this book and some articles about called the spinal engine theory, and that's where a lot of the ideas kind of came from. Where I and Franz Bosch has done a lot of good work, exposing some of those ideas as well. So basically when we're sprinting, I want to see movement in the pelvis where the pelvis is oscillating in the right way. When I say oscillating, I mean going tilting back and forth. I want to see it undulating in the right way, where it's tilting kind of up and down with each side. And I want to see it'll be rotating posteriorly and anteriorly in proper sequence. Some people are better oscillators and they kind of skaters, if you know what I mean. Some people are more undulators and bounce a little bit more. People that are inexperienced or poor sprinters tend to get stuck in pelvic tilt areas. Um, so they lack front side mechanics. So whenever I'm watching sprinting and one of my athletes running, I want to watch and see how those movements are, kind of get a signature for how they like to move. And then if I feel like there's some weaknesses in the way they're causing problems, then I try to adjust them in different ways with through cueing or possibly through different therapy techniques or stretches or lots of different ways to try to get them back to maybe what I think might be an ideal way to do it. Um, so yeah, it's just every little movement that starts in the spine and the pelvis magnifies into all our limbs. And so when you see weird limb movements that are hard to explain, a lot of times it comes back to the pelvis and how the back and the pelvis and the shoulders are moving. And if we can fix those kind of things and create the right bounce in the run and things like that, a lot of those problems tend to go away.
Nice. So, I think it's a few months ago I saw like Stu McMillan uh posted an article. I forgot it's on Instagram or something like that. It talks about like spinal engine theory. And
Mm-hmm.
a few weeks ago, I talked with Rolf Ullman about like spinal engine theory. But for those who are not familiar with spinal engine theory, and you also mentioned like French Bosch system, can you like give us some like probably explain it a little bit to us, like what is spinal engine theory and how does that like correlate with let's say like things like hip block?
Right. Yeah, it's maybe a little different thing to explain. If you ever read any of like some of the material, it's very high level biomechanics, and it's maybe like a basic idea is it talks about a lot of things like from basic back from possibly when lizards maybe were lizards and how they move and how like when they tilt their back and spine shifts to as they take a step and then their this pelvic side kind of turns this way and they kind of do that. So it's just ideas based on how that maybe evolutionary theories about how people learn to move and from a long time ago from maybe previous things. It's hard to explain exactly. And so there needs to be a good movement in the in mid thoracic. So it's kind of like So as our shoulder moves forward, our hip needs to go forward on the opposite side. And as our back, and as we push with the other leg, our shoulder needs to move back, and the shoulders will kind of rise and fall with each movement. The lower spot being in the mid stance, and then it rises as it goes, and you'll see the shoulder go forward. And people that have issues with the way they move in the mid thoracic, sometimes they'll have adhesions or just don't understand how to move, or inflexibility, and you won't see that same movement. So some of the great sprinters that you watch, some of them tend to look really natural that way. And sometimes people get confused when they watch it. They'll sort of think that these movements are, because it's not all straight and symmetrical, and the arms aren't 90 degrees, and the shoulders they think the shoulders need to be straight, and the hips should be straight, and all these little things that create these ridiculous blockages that just aren't natural. So, for instance, if you see people running with their elbows totally locked at 90 degrees, they have huge amount of movement that has to happen in the thoracic in order to balance them. So the arms need to balance the legs, and what's going on the opposite arm has to follow what's going on the opposite leg. And Dan used to talk about interesting things like how if someone had really tight wrists, they tend to have really tight ankles, and if they got loose kind of floppy wrists, and they have loose ankles. And there's a lot of interesting neural connections that happen between the upper body and what the lower body do. There's so many different ways to look at it. And so basically it's a hot little long and winded way of talking about spinal engine theory, and definitely simplified on it. That's basically what it is. It's just the little movements in the spine amplify the body in the limbs. And so if we correct things in the way the spine and the pelvis move, then we have a much better chance to influence how the limbs move.
Love it. Love your approach. So do you think that, or like, is it the same with when Frans Bosch System talks about like hip lock?
Yes, yeah, sorry, hip lock is really basically when the pelvis is undulating up. So when we push off, we'll have on the grounded side, our hip is lower, and as we rise on the other opposite side, the lifting swing knee side, we'll see a tilt in the pelvis. So when you're watching people sprint, you should see from the back where they'll go like this. So sometimes I'll have people like tuck their shirt in, and you'll be able to see some of that movement up and down as they run. And so I got to work with Gary Winkler for a little while when I was with Athletics Canada, and he had really kind of popularized some of the Frans Bosch stuff with some of the sprint mechanics. So I got to see a lot of interesting things from him. And one of the things that is in that book that talks a lot is, well, say when the body's bouncing and the grounding, there's that hip will drop on the side that is free, and then that causes a rather mushy landing and a slow contact. So creating the right stiffness in the torso, and learning how to time up the right landings. Also, if your feet are out in front of you and you're kind of pulling on the ground, those are going to cause that kind of mushy drop on the one side. So if we use the body in the right way, the body kind of works like a spring and bouncy, and we're using our reflexes instead of volitional control, which is so much faster, especially the speeds that sprinting is at. When you're on the ground for less than 1/10 of a second, thinking about how to do it and kind of create those moves is almost impossible. So we need to use the body's natural reflexes in order to make it happen. So, Frans in that book, in his famous book, talks a lot about using the reflexes, and stumble reflex and cross extensor reflex. And as Gary used to use that with hurdling, and he used to do a lot of different interesting drills. And he was one of the first people I saw use a lot of those Frans ideas to pretty cool effect in sprinting. And he had a lot of high level hurdlers, and I got to watch him work with Pretty de Felicien at that time. And so it was really interesting to see how he used it, and we used to use it all the time.
Great, love this. Thank you for like explaining it in that way. So, you mentioned that Gary Winkler, am I?
Yes, Gary was the head coach at University of Illinois for a long time. He was very well known for producing a lot of high-level hurdlers. from Pretty to Felicien was a world champion, not Olympic champion, unfortunately. A fortunate fall took her out of that when she was the favorite. But and a lot of Susanna Kallur and her sister as well. He's had a lot of high level hurdlers. At University of Illinois was where he was a head coach of.
Nice. So you basically finished the question I have for like the how should we look at the hip movement when we look at in the front side, back side, and lateral.
Mm-hmm.
So the next thing is like since we're talking about like um the spine or the hip movement and basically the shoulder should counterbalance is counterbalance the word right? Counterbalance the hip or like balance the hip. And
Yeah, I would say counterbalance could be a good word. I mean, it's work in a opposition to what happens to the hip. So when the hip on the right side moves forward, the right side shoulder moves forward, and you'll
yeah,
see
yeah,
kind of like from above, if you were to watch it, you'll see the shoulders tilt on one side and the legs form tilt on the
yeah,
other. So it kind of makes like an X over top where the two axes are moving back and forth. And when you push off, you're creating a lot of stretch in the hip flexors and the
yeah,
abdominals, and then that gets on a stretch and bounces the leg forward. Um, so yeah, when you're looking from the front, you want to see that your knee comes a little more to midline and not just straight up and down. The knee comes to and crosses towards the midline when you're pushing. When you're looking from the side, you'll see on that you'll lift your knee up, and then hopefully you'll see the opposite side glute, because then we've tilted the pelvis forward on that. So
yeah.
yeah, other things you might look for as well.
So, uh, is there like is there other ways to train like these movement or to correct these movement if let's say our sprinter doesn't have like good thoracic mobility or like good hip mobility or like motor control besides sprinting?
Yeah, I use sprinting as kind of the test for what I think is going on, and then there's lots of different interventions you can use, there to increase the thoracic mobility. From in a regular day setting, we'll often do things like Russian twists, where we'll keep our pelvis at a rather neutral spot, where we let the shoulders turn and the kind of swinging movements with a weight or with a bar on your back to try to create some movement in there and just to maintain it day to day. There's different therapy you can use, from different like hard balls to massage out the area possibly, and so that mid thoracic. I'm talking about that area in your lower ribs between there and your just where your scapula start. There's hurdle mobility is another movement that could help create some of that. And there's different ways you can maybe hold your shoulders and block your shoulders to make your pelvis move a little bit more, or exaggerate that move to create a little bit more movement downstairs. Having a good therapist can make a big difference. Someone that can do soft tissue work to make sure things are moving in the right way. And just a good coaching eye to see it, because it's very there's so many times people are coaching and they're working on these kind of myths that they need to do. You need to be up on your toes, you need to be work 90-degree arms, you need to you should be stable in your pelvis and in your core, and that we need to be dynamically strong in our core and use it. And if you watch some of the great sprinters, someone like a Usain Bolt, like it's like he's putting his body on a whip and uncoiling, and it looks like a leopard running down the ground, where they're it's amazing to watch. And I'll see people criticize him thinking that he's doing way too much and he's got all these obscure movements, and if we just kind of constrain it down, what would he run? The answer was he'd probably run 10 flat or something
Yeah,
bad, and he hurt a lot.
yeah. I recently I talked to a lot of like sprint coaches and I there's an interesting I think it's interesting like thing I noticed that is that people in the performance world they don't really know what's going on in or yeah they don't really know what's going on the side of like sprint side of those stuff and
When you say
so
performance, do you mean like strength coaches and things like
yeah
that?
yeah
Yeah,
strength and
right.
condition yeah so there's like so because books like, let's say, NSCA, there's always talking about like uh that their elbow should be like 90-degree, and their what I can't remember the number, but there's always talking about like triple extension, push hard. But as I
Yeah, that
like
doesn't happen.
yeah, since as I talk to like coaches like Lauren Seagrave or like Rolf Ehrman, like you mentioned that these things doesn't really happen.
Mhm. Yeah, when you like the idea of triple extension, I mean, in those early steps, you want to see your body extend, almost completely. And I think I still strive for those kind of things. You want to see a line between your ear, your shoulder, your hip, knee, and ankle in those early steps. So you're getting complete push off. But when we're sprinting at max speed, we don't want to see the calf ankle like drop really far, and we don't want to see the hip the femur should move a little bit behind the plumb line of the body, but not dramatically so. So it isn't really like a full extension. And if the knee extends, that means you're tending to tilt your pelvis forward, and there's wasted energy, and you're not going to be able to create as much of an upper a bouncing kind of component that needs to happen. And elite sprinters create a lot of force in the early portion of the contact, and they had to attack the ground and work. There's a lot of force in the early part of the contact and a little late. So they create so much energy in the beginning of the contact that they don't need to keep hanging out the back. And people with poorer mechanics tend to land out in front of them a little bit and push out behind in the back and have these like kind of mushy long contacts that elite sprinters don't have. So yeah, I remember hearing that as a kid, those kind of ideas like triple extension and thinking I got to extend my knee, and I didn't understand it, and it caused me a lot of injuries, and and I look back at some of my mechanics back then, it was just misconceptions of what was supposed
Yeah,
to look like. And then when I started running much faster and went from like 21 flat to 20.5, for instance, my mechanics looked very different, and I you didn't see that same kind of extension and in my knees as I ran. It was just more attacking the ground, and my pelvis was much more underneath me, for instance. And and then in looking back on it, it's kind of interesting to see, yeah. So elite sprinters don't have that same, and you don't the same that idea of triple extension, except
yeah,
maybe in those first 3, 4 steps.
yeah. So, um, since you're like a jump coach,
Mhm.
today's podcast, I would like put a lot of focus on jump training. But since we talk a little bit about like brought up a little bit about like traditional or like in the performance world, we tend to see everything as triple extension. So I want to know like your thoughts on like jump training and how, because like in the track and field words, there's like approach jump and there's like horizontal jump.
Mhm.
So is that kind of how does that differ with what we used to train? Like let's say want to train our basketball player like jump high, so we probably load them to like triple extension. How does that differ? And how is that like probably is it kind of similar with like training track guys like sprinters?
Yeah, when you say jump training, you mean like plyometrics, like yeah, right. You know, there's with track and field, the jumping events are all of them come in with a running component and stuff like that. So there's so much running technique involved in creating the right actions to happen at the takeoffs. So um, and plyometrics like will prepare the body for handling some of those forces. When I'm coaching people in track and field, we do plyometrics and jumping type routines with that bounding routines and hurdle hopping routines. And we'll try to learn to create vertical forces and horizontal forces. And can you create horizontal forces and be able to get your pelvis in line and your limbs in line to make another extreme horizontal performance? So we try to train kind of a lot of different angles in order to create what we need. So for instance, if I'm training someone to do a good accelerator, there's a lot of horizontal movement in there. So I try to do fairly longer contact, kind of pushing out kind of moves that are more horizontal. And then if I'm training maximum velocity, for instance, I try to have a lot of vertical contacts, maybe with and mix a lot with it between like having maybe maximum height type jumps that you can, like a hurdle hop that you can recover from, or a box jump or something like that, where there's a little longer contact time and also kind of short, quick contact times. So, you're trying to train on all ends of the like force continuum, and ground contact times between high to faster to shorter, and a lot of different angles as well, from horizontal to vertical. So, I don't see too much of the general kind of what a lot of the performance coaches are doing to know exactly how much they train those kind of things. And so, I'm around a gym where they do that. A lot of the stuff they're always kind of balancing what's going on the field versus what they need to do in the weight room. So yeah, probably some of the things they don't have access to, compared to being on the track, since a lot of the time they spend so much time in the weight room. But I think if I were training a basketball player to jump, I'd use a lot of the same concepts. And a basketball jump, going up to a layup or something like that, or up for a dunk, it's very similar to, say, a high jump takeoff or a long jump takeoff. So I think for some of those coaches, they might learn something from learning how penultimate mechanics work and running, and creating some of those movements that and amplifying them, making them stronger and that kind of thing.
Cool. So, like you mentioned, so probably performance coaches or like strength and conditioning coaches should learn more about, like, if we want to train our, let's say, our basketball player for layup, we should probably learn how to like jump in different angle and to expose them to like different types, not really different of like contact time of jump,
Mhm.
different height of the hurdle, right?
Yeah, and so many times they do a lot of these things in the basic game anyway, So, they're already creating a lot of those moves. So, as a strength coach, I think you want to look at, how many contacts do they get in a general practice, and how much can they handle to do more, and then just I think working on the big continuum of different force and time, and emphasizing all, there's so many, so that they're well-rounded, and maybe have some of those skills, that they could develop, and as a strength coach you could improve.
Yeah. So the next thing I want to discuss is like how does like or like jumping affects our like sprinting performance, or like if we want to train our sprinters, is like, let's say if we train our athlete to like sprint faster, train is it gonna help them to like jump higher?
Mhm. Yeah, it's an interesting with jumping and sprinting. There's obviously a huge correlation between performance in jumps, for instance, with sprint speed, and the faster the jumper, um, the the more potential they have to hit a big jump than, say, long jump or triple jump. But there's also a component of how can they set up their body and have the right postures in order to allow the big jump. And so it's a tricky thing. There's a lot of skill involved in setting up a big jump, and having sprint speed helps. But if there's ways that we coach jumpers that are a little different, where we create a little more of a bouncy type run, and it can't be at absolute maximum speeds, because there isn't quite enough of a when we run, there's always a little bit of an undulation of the body. We're kind of bouncing down the track. When we do jumping events, we'll tend to amplify it a little bit more, so they can't reach maybe quite the same speeds, but then they can set up a big takeoff in an easier manner. So as a coaching people in jumps, we need to find a way to like maximize that speed, and also be able to still set it up on the jumps. And so its speed is really valuable, but at the same time, if we take it too far, we won't be able to create quite as enough bounce to set up a jump. So it's kind of in jumping training, it's like to find the right athlete, the hand speed they can handle, and try to push it a little further, and can they still set up a takeoff and jump? So, I mean, it's a lot of the jump training really has a huge impact on sprint performance. And you'll see a lot of people that come from jumps backgrounds and end up being world-class sprinters. You know, for instance, like Bruni Surin, who was an Olympic medalist and gold medalist in the 4x1 and a 984 sprinter back when 984 was fast. He came as a sprinter. You know, Glenroy Gilbert was another Olympic gold medalist in the 4x1, was a jumper as well. Bruni was a jumper. 8-meter long jumper when he was like 18, 19 kind of area. Tori Bowie was a great jumper that turned into a world-class sprinter and ran 10.8. Maybe even 10.7.
I think the Jacob Marcelo was a jumper, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Perfect. Yeah,
and
Marcel Jacobs.
turns
Yeah.
out probably I'm not gonna say this, but he wins the gold medal.
He was in 100 meters, yeah, and he had pretty good long jump potential too. It's a interesting. I think some of the jumping training and some of the jumping mechanics of a run up. You know, it teaches you proper posture in a way that's a little slowed down a little bit because there is a little more air. And um, with some people, it's kind of weird, but had sprinters that I trained where I had them do like something like jump approaches to learn the mechanics of a jump approach, because it's basically like the perfect acceleration slowed down just a little bit, so you got a little more time to feel the positions and get into that nice upright posture to run that you need to set up to jump. So yeah, I've used that as a training tool a lot with different people that didn't even intend to jump. But yes, there's been so many great jumpers that turned into sprinters, and some of it is just the money because they make a lot more money sprinting than they do jumping, so they get power. I know, influenced by the shoe companies to turn into sprinters if they have the potential to. But yeah, there's learning the mechanics properly that you need to in order to be a great jumper. If you are going to be a great jumper and last any kind of length of time, you need to have outstanding upright mechanics when you're coming into the takeoff. Otherwise, you'll just stick your foot out, beat up your shin and knees and ankles, and be in bad shape. So it forces you to learn really good mechanics and jumping, and sometimes that carries over to high level sprinting, and even in all the jumping that they do, plyometric training creates some great sprinting mechanics and abilities. So yeah.
Cool. So um when I look at like jumpers, like long jumpers, and there's like they need to run a little bit to create the horizontal or like the vertical force to jump.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to think at the first few, it's kind of like, is it kind of like bounding instead of like acceleration, or it's it's acceleration?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it, from different starts where people will maybe skip in or bound at the beginning, or some kind of bend over just like a sprinter, and just it looks just like a 100-meter acceleration almost. I think a lot of jumpers like to create a little bit of an upward component in their run, and so some of them might use. And another thing, at the beginning of a run, we want a lot of force on the ground and to use the ground to get our acceleration up. And so sometimes people use those kind of boundy type starts, or even if it's not a full bound per se, just there is a little more vertical component and a little more of a be on the ground. If we create the right impulse at the beginning of the run, we tend to do much better things at the end when we're setting up the jump on the takeoff. So yeah, you see that quite a lot where people will kind of bound out of the beginning and then start to speed it up. And yeah, I think sometimes people do things like that just instinctively to help them get the right feelings that they need. And some see other people do it and copy and kind of think that's how it should look, or coaches that emphasize different ways of doing it based on maybe previous people they worked with that were successful. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it. But I think that when you see that kind of bounding, it's a way to kind of feel the vertical up and down on the run, and it helps set up that takeoff. And too boundy and it ends up being too slow. So you have to kind of find the right way for each person. And I think everyone kind of has an interesting, unique signature of like how they need to run in order to get set up a good takeoff. And so as a coach, we might experiment with different things to get that too.
Cool. So uh And I also have a question for like jumpers. Let's say for long jump, at the end of like the last step, it's sort of like transition or like put all the energy they stored at the last step and take off, right?
Mhm.
So as a strength coach, I view it as like they need to have probably like strong isometric strength or strong ex
Mhm.
eccentric strength, but does that as a sprint coach or as a like jump coach, what are your thoughts on like creating this kind of like is it stiffness or creating this kind of like elasticity? How to train this? Does like weight room work really like transfer to that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's difficult to ever really measure. So much of the training that you do to create that creates also some of the strength in those limbs to do it as well, right? And the mechanics are so important. I would say more of it is mechanics necessarily than strength or anything. It's a skill that's extremely challenging to learn. There's so much going on in a jump takeoff and a long jump, especially. It's going, but you have to maintain so much speed in order to create a good jump. And how do you create that vertical force while you do it? It's a complicated thing to master. So we'll definitely do weight training to strengthen up, the legs or, um, and with weight training with the jumper, you have to be careful with how much muscle mass they might put on. And so that's one thing that, if you create a lot of strength by doing a lot of creating a lot of extra muscle mass, then that might hurt you in your ability to take off anyway, right? So high levels of maximum strength are really important. Being powerful and able to work at provide force at really high velocities is really important. Um, so we'll train it by different bounding exercises and throwing exercises, from throwing shots or medicine balls or things like that. Weight training from Olympic lifting is, as a big component of the training. Pretty much everyone will have some amount of squatting or step ups or something like that, deadlifting possibly to increase the maximum strength. So, when we're taking off on the board, we're planting our foot and then we're creating stiffness in the knee, and then our knee needs to bend and rebound to create the force. And so having good maximum strength is important. But we just need to create the right balance in the training that we don't get lost trying to, there's a certain amount of strength that's valuable. And then once it gets beyond that level for each individual, it becomes pretty minimal importance. So we just need to maintain it at that point. But creating greater and greater strength isn't going to necessarily solve the problem. Um, Even just the jumping creates higher tension in the muscles than weightlifting ever could. So just doing the movements and doing different biometrics creates a lot of it. But strength training is definitely important. It also creates the right hormone environment, maybe to recover from training and to be elite.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask another hard question, and I think I asked a lot of like hard questions. I put you in a hard position today. I'm sorry about that. But
It's okay.
I really love your thoughts and your experience on these kind of on your training. So, um, do you um do you think that as or like from performance side, do you think that sprinters or like uh jumpers should really do like uh strength training or like max strength training? Because like I think there's kind of a trend that if we want to like train our athlete to get faster, they should just expose them to like sprint faster. If we want to like train our athlete to like jump higher, we should just let them jump higher. And it kind of like weight room is more of a accessory work to like keep their tendon health or ligament health, that kind of stuff. So what are your thoughts on like these kind of like uh discuss?
Yeah, I would say what you're talking about, specificity of of training for the event that you're doing. That's where we get the most bang for your buck. Honestly, that's where you want to put most of your emphasis. But if that's all you do, you probably run out of ways to improve. And so, I think using other methods like strength training or definitely might will create maybe a bigger engine to produce more force and we can't just be totally specific to the event. We need to use some other components in order to create the right environment or just to create the right the right body to create to do those things. So specificity is the most important thing, honestly. But if that's all we do, we're gonna get stale pretty quick and run out of ways to make gains. I think doing strength training and in the right dosages and in the right time is extremely valuable. And I don't think you'll find too many people at high levels that don't use some form of strength training. Yeah, specificity is king though. So, and then sometimes people get really wrapped up in some of the extra things and waste tons of energy on them, and their performance and what they're really trying to do can suffer. So, we've got to have the right components and the right balance in order to create what we're trying to do. So yeah, it's some things like lifting weights. You can see that number of the squat go up, and it makes you feel good, and you think that you're gaining, and then you think like, okay, people that run 10:30 in the 100 meters can all squat 300 pounds, and they can do. People think things like that, or in order you need to clean this number, and it's I've trained with and seen really high level people that are really weak strength wise and can't do that. And if they were trained in that way, would probably destroy them. But then there's other people that need those things in order to create it too. So I think as a coach, we want to make sure we're using a lot of different ways, and as over time, you guys start to get to learn an athlete and what they need more of and what they need a little less of. And I think the answer, there's everyone needs a lot of different components, but how much of each one becomes an interesting problem to solve, especially when you're working with older athletes that are nearing their performance limits, and you got to decide how much of this we need and how little of that. And when I work with a range, a lot of people come in and they haven't done a lot of training, and so I just kind of put out a plan on what I think is probably pretty good. And as they're older, you start tweaking things a little bit and find out that one athlete needs a little more of this and another one, and you come up with a theory and test it out, and hopefully you're right more than you're wrong. But yeah, the specificity and then just the individuality of it all, there's a lot going on there, and it's really hard to measure and without experimenting.
Love that. So that's kind of like all the question I have for today. So I know I put a very hard position to answer those difficult questions. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I'm very interested in stuff like spinal engine theory, but and I've studied a lot of biomechanics, but sit down and explain it, it's not easy. It's a
Yeah,
lot to it.
yeah. So if there's like coaches and therapists are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
And one of my emails is gpsmith 2051 at gmail.com. Or at the university, gsmith at athletics.ucf.edu. I'm on Twitter, coach_gsmith, or Instagram as well. I put out videos with some of my athletes, or just little different ideas on Twitter and on Instagram. So if you're interested in seeing some of the things I do, you can reach out to me. You can reach out to me in those spots.
Love it.